The first session is titled Reforms for Public Sector Governance. Let us now proceed, and as I invite the speakers, I would also like to introduce them. Our moderator for this session is Tan Sri Dato Sri Dr. Haji Muhammad Ismail Merican. A bit of background about him. He is a Pro-Chancellor and Chairman of the Board of Governors, Masa University, Malaysia, as well as a Senior Consultant Physician at Consultant Hepatologist. He's a graduate from University of Malaya, and he went to pursue his postgraduate in internal medicine at Royal Postgraduate Medical School at Hammersmith Hospital in London in 1980. He's also the founder and current president of the Malaysian Liver Foundation, and his expertise in liver disease is widely acknowledged and guidance sought by various international organizations. To name a few, World Health Organizations, the United National Development Program, and the World Bank. Tan Sri has to date numerous publications in local, regional, and international peer-reviewed journals. That's right. Tan Sri Muhammad Ismail is also an honorary clinical consultant with the medical faculty of University Putra Malaysia, University Technology Mara, and amongst others. He chairs many regulatory, advisory, registration, and licensing committees and expert group in his official capacity. Tan Sri Muhammad Ismail was also Director of General of Health Malaysia and President of the Malaysian Medical Council from 2005 to 2011. I would like to invite Tan Sri Merican Ismail to the stage, please. Round of applause. Now the speakers that will be joining us. You want to announce it?
I will announce this.
All right, great. This is going great already. Round of applause, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Shafiq. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And a very good morning to you, ladies and gentlemen. Let me first of all welcome you to this much needed forum, which is entitled Reforms for the Progressive Malaysia, organized by G25. Now G25, as you know, would like our country Malaysia to be led by the rule of law, good governance, respect for human rights, and align herself to the federal constitution and the spirit of Rukun Negara, so that all Malaysians, irrespective of who you are or which ethnic group or social strata you belong to, will live peacefully and harmoniously and respect one another's different cultural beliefs or viewpoints. We would like Malaysians to be able to express themselves freely on important matters such as security, the economy, education, and of course health. We are now in 2018, ladies and gentlemen, and in 2 years, we are set to achieve a developed country status, or so we think. Now, in the developed country, one must behave in a civilized manner, embrace differences of opinion, learn to listen more, be moderate, tolerant, and ensure that justice, fair play, and compassion are firmly entrenched in society. We all have the right to expect and insist that the government of the day will protect us from laggards and troublemakers and allow us to go about our daily routine in peace without any hassle. If we need help from the civil service, we do not have to call up someone important first and ask for assistance. We just have to go to the relevant ministry or department to get things done. We expect a prompt and efficient service, nothing less. We expect the government of the day to protect us, as long as we do not break any laws, of course. Now, for this to happen, we need good governance and reforms, especially in the public sector. Now, Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India, once said, and I quote, "Mere good governance is not enough. It has to be pro-people and proactive. And good governance is putting people at the center of the development process," unquote. Gloria Arroyo once said, and I quote, "We have to be bold in our national ambitions. First, we must win the fight against poverty. Second, we must improve moral standards in government and society to provide a strong foundation for good governance. And third, we must change the character of our politics to promote fertile grounds for reforms, and I quote, unquote. One more quote, ladies and gentlemen, by Mark Goider, who was director of Tomorrow's Company, and this is a very interesting quote, and I quote, "Governance and leadership are the yin and yang of successful organizations. If you have leadership without governance, you risk tyranny, fraud, and personal fiefdoms. If you have governance without leadership, you risk atrophy, bureaucracy, and indifference," unquote. As you have heard, I was once the Director General of Health. It was then that I realized that you can do so many things, make so many changes, institute so many reforms for the betterment of the health sector. The minister will heed your advice, as the Ministry of Health is a technical ministry, and the DG's advice carries weight. Of course, the DG must be sane and wise and offer his advice only after discussing important issues with his relevant officers and the stakeholders. The life in the Ministry of Health was good, I thought, and there was hardly any interference from the political masters. Today, I'm not so sure. Are civil servants providing fair and selfless input to their respective ministers, or are they coerced by the mere presence of the ministers and simply carry out instructions without blinking an eyelid, perhaps protect and preserve the position? There is a quote by Tun Razak circulating among us G25 members recently, and I quote, "As civil servants, I hope you will stand up to us politicians and not allow yourselves to be dominated by us, because in a true democracy, the civil servants have a duty to perform, and the future of our country's democratic way of life is dependent on you," unquote. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this morning we have three illustrious speakers to talk to us about reforms for public sector governance. Now, all of them have an incredible track record and the same DNA. They speak their minds without fear or favor, armed with an enormous amount of experience and knowledge in their respective areas of expertise. Now, before I call upon the first speaker, ladies and gentlemen, may I suggest that in the interest of time, we allow all of them to speak first before we take questions from the floor. Each speaker will be given 15 to 20 minutes at most, so that we can have a lively 30 minutes discussion at the end. Is that okay with everyone? Thank you very much. So let me now introduce our very first speaker, Dato Dr. Noor Farida Ariffin. Now, she has had a long and distinguished career in the public sector as a judge, legal advisor, and diplomat. She was the ambassador of Malaysia to Netherlands and was the Malaysian permanent representative to the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. She held the position of Director General of Research, Treaties and International Law at the Foreign Ministry and was appointed as a member of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees Advisory Group on the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees and the 1961 Convention on reducing statelessness. Since her retirement from the Foreign Ministry in 2012, she continues to be involved in multiple activities and is now head of the Law Reform Committee at the National Council of Women's Organization and actively works on women's rights issues in Malaysia, including holding a position as a trustee for the Women's Aid Organization. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasant duty to invite Dato Noor Farida Ariffin to speak to us on institutional reforms for the rule of law involving MACC, police, AG, and judiciary. Dato, Noor, please.
I think you need to. Thank you, Tan Sri. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your presence this morning. Assalamualaikum, salam sejahtera, and very good morning. As Tan Sri Ismail has already announced, my presentation today will be on institutional reforms for the rule of law, and I will speak specifically on Attorney General's Office, the MACC, the police force, and the judiciary. Firstly, I will touch on proposed reforms of the Office of the Attorney General. The AG currently performs dual roles as public prosecutor, thank you, and also as legal advisor for the government. This has created problems of accountability and hindered prosecution of corruption cases involving government officials and particularly political heads of ministries and government agencies. Good governance calls for the separation of the two roles, which will result in greater public confidence in the criminal justice system. And this will avoid conflict of interest and the suspicion or perception of political interference with regard to the AG's prosecutorial function. And this is nothing new. We had proposed this before and was met with a very hostile reception from the current Attorney General. And most of the Western countries, including Commonwealth countries, especially UK, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, the functions of the Attorney General as public prosecutor and the Attorney General as advisor to the government are distinct and separate. And in the UK especially, public prosecutions headed, the Department of Public Prosecutions is headed by the Director of Public Prosecutions, which is also known as the DPP's office. Now, Article 145 of the Federal Constitution and Section 376 of the Criminal Procedure Code would need to be amended to redefine the functions of the Attorney General and to establish the separate independent office of the Director of Public Prosecutions, or DPP. Right now, DPP stands for Deputy Public Prosecutor, and the DPPs are normally a department within the criminal department, criminal prosecution department of the Attorney General. Now we propose, this is our proposal on how the AG and DPP are to be appointed. Currently, the AG is appointed or removed by His Majesty, the Yang di-Pertuan Agong, on the advice of the Prime Minister. The AG thus could be perceived to be beholden to the Prime Minister. What needs to be done and the actions that need to be taken, in our view, is to ensure the independence of the office. So we propose that the AG should be appointed with security of tenure or terminated by His Majesty on the advice not of the Prime Minister, but on the advice of an independent commission through a transparent, accountable, and merit-based process. Likewise, to secure the independence of the Director of Public Prosecutions in the exercise of its functions, the appointment, again with security of tenure, or termination by His Majesty the Yang di-Pertuan Agong will be upon the advice of the same independent commission, adopting the same process based on the principles of accountability, transparency, and merit-based. And during periods of budgetary constraints, these two agencies should share the burden of lower allocations as other agencies in the public sector. Now, this is important because even though, of course, Article 145 says that the AG is appointed by the Yang di-Pertuan Agong, but it is on the advice of the Prime Minister, which the Yang di-Pertuan Agong has to accept. So, in effect, it's the Prime Minister who determines the appointment of the AG. And as we have seen recently, with regard to the previous AG, Tan Sri Gani Patel, who was a member of the task force to investigate SRC, the allegations against SRC and the 1MDB, just before the task force had completed its work and made its recommendations, he was removed. He was removed by the Prime Minister. No reason, the reason given was for health reasons, and he was immediately replaced within 24 hours by the current AG, Tan Sri Apandi. So you can see that this is a very unwelcome development, and this is an interference in the independence of the AG, and this is something that we need to avoid if we want to maintain or if we want to promote good governance in the office of the AG, which is a very important office. Secondly, I will touch on the institutional reform, our proposals for institutional reform to ensure the independence of the MACC. The MACC must function independently and impartially with structural protection from government control or dictate in order to be a viable and potent entity to eradicate corruption in the country. And the actions that we're proposing for this to happen this can be achieved by setting up an independent anti-corruption commission, or the IACC, as mandated through a constitutional amendment. The MACC will then be established as the investigative arm under the oversight of and within the IACC. A constitutional commission is beyond the scope and control of the executive, meaning the cabinet, with independent commissioners holding security of tenure serving the commission. IACC commissioners will be appointed or terminated by a parliamentary select committee on corruption. Next is our proposal for governance for checks and balances in the PDRM or in the police force. The Malaysian police system is highly centralized and states are not given any police mandate under the federal constitution. The Inspector General of Police, or the IGP, is only answerable to the Home Minister. This centralized position has proven to be detrimental in protecting citizens' rights under the federal constitution because of weak governance and the absence of checks and balances in the leadership of the police force. The Police Force Commission, or the PFC, which exercises disciplinary control, lacks independence since it is chaired by the Home Minister, with the IGP as a member, together with 6 other members from the PFC. All in all, the PFC's membership compromises its impartiality. The result has been a lack of professionalism, veiled abuse of power, and impunity on the part of the police force. The Enforcement Agency Integrity Commission, or the EAIC, has been ineffective from the lack of resources and with insufficient powers to compel enforcement agencies to take action. Other entities like the AG's office and the MACC have also failed to provide remedies to aggrieved citizens about police misconduct. And you can see this in the so many cases that we have of death in police custody, where there's been no investigation, no action has been taken, and the police this misconduct has resulted in impunity for the police. The actions that we're proposing, we support the recommendations of ideas to decentralize and separate police powers according to several key areas of competencies for checks and balances and to promote greater accountability. And we are also in favor of the establishment of the Independent Police Complaints and Misconduct Commission, or the IPCMC, to place it beyond executive influence and to report to Parliament with mandatory investigative powers on police misconduct and the authority to recommend disciplinary action. Last but not least, I'm going to touch on one of the most important institutions in our country, which is one of the 3 organs of government. The 3 organs, of course, we have the judiciary, the Parliament, the judiciary, and the executive. And the independence and strengthening of the judiciary is most important if we are to be a viable democracy, and if we are going to promote checks and balances and the rule of law in our country, and to promote a viable democracy. And the measures we're proposing to ensure independence of the judiciary are: the fundamentals of good governance are set in the independence and separation of powers between the three organs of government, which I've already mentioned, the judiciary, the parliament, and the executive. If the independence of the judiciary has suffered currently accelerating erosion over the past few decades, the legal framework on the clear separation of powers between the executive and the judiciary must be restored. The actions that we're proposing includes, we recommend that Parliament should amend Article 121, Clause 1 of the Federal Constitution to restore the original provision that vested the judicial power of the Federation in the High Courts of Malaya and Sabah and Sarawak. In this context, the G25 wholeheartedly applauds the recent courageous and innovative judgment of the Federal Court in the case of Semenyih Jaya Sdn Bhd versus Pentadbir Tanah Daerah Hulu Langat that restores the judicial power of the judiciary and the doctrine of the separation of powers. In so ruling, the Federal Court has propounded two important principles of constitutional law, and these are: one, that the independence of the judiciary and the doctrine of the separation of powers are basic features of the Federal Constitution, and two, that Parliament has no power to amend the Federal Constitution with a view to remove these two basic features. And most importantly, we must have a transparent process and reforms in the appointment and promotion of judges. Under the Federal Constitution, judges nominated by the Judicial Appointment Commission, or the JAC, are appointed by His Majesty the Yang di-Pertuan Agong on the advice of the Prime Minister after consultation with the Conference of Rulers. This is provided for under Article 122B. The Prime Minister is not obliged to give a reason if he were to reject a nomination by the JAC. As His Majesty is constitutionally obliged to act on the advice of the Prime Minister, the person who effectively decides on the appointments and promotions of judges is the Prime Minister. This system of appointment is unsatisfactory because it gives rise to the perception that the judiciary is beholden to the executive. And this stems from the fact that the Prime Minister is the head of the executive branch and exerts substantial influence on the legislature. It is clear that there are times when judges have to make unfavorable decisions involving the executive or members of the legislature, and some judges may allow their decisions to be influenced by the fear of being passed over for promotions if they were to render a decision which is unfavorable to members of these institutions. And many of us privately know of cases where this has happened before. And of course, we have seen recently where the Prime Minister decided to extend, unconstitutionally, is argued by many constitutional lawyers, the tenure of our present Chief Justice as well as the tenure of the President of the Court of Appeal. And the actions we propose is that the Prime Minister plays no role at all in the appointment of judges. The JAC, instead of the Prime Minister, should recommend the names of judges to be appointed or to be promoted to the Conference of Rulers for their views, and thereafter to the Agong. A constitutional amendment is of course required for this to be effective. And in conclusion, let me say that Malaysia must restore public confidence in good governance practices so that citizens and investors are confident that laws, regulations, procedures and processes will be implemented with appropriate checks and balances. As mentioned earlier in my presentation, but which bears repeating, the key areas most essential to rebuild the strong foundations for supporting a viable democracy and sustainable, inclusive economic growth are: 1, strengthening the independence of the judiciary; 2, making the legislative system dynamic, that will be touched on by my colleague Tan Sri Sharif Kassim; 3, improving public sector performance; and last but not least, restoring a clean government. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dato Farida. I think you have touched on some very salient importance and recommend some very pertinent reforms which we can discuss at the end of the 3 presentations. Thank you, Dato Farida. Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce the next speaker, Dato Latifah Merican Cheong. Now, she is advisor for International Organization of Financial Stability and Macroeconomic Policies, Structural Reforms, and Growth-Oriented Development Programs, and is an independent director of an investment bank and managed a foundation on education to influence change in communities. Past experiences include being the Assistant Governor of Bank Negara Malaysia, Program Director in the World Bank Finance Sector Work, a member of the UNDP Asia Strategic Panel and advisor in the Securities Commission of Malaysia. She also provides substantive input into the new economic model issued by the National Economic Advisory Council. Now, there was a quote by David Cameron, and I quote, "The economy is the start and the end of everything. You can't have successful educational reform or any other reform if you don't have a strong economy," unquote. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dato Latifah to talk to us on reforms for stronger economic growth.
Thank you, Tan Sri, for the introduction. Is this good enough? I hope you can even see my face. Assalamualaikum, salam sejahtera, and good morning to all. I'll focus today on the economic issues. I just have a one-page mind map. I hope I can do it within the allocated time frame. In the book that we have issued, we have made quite substantive proposals on some of the key economic issues. I will not be able to run through all of them, but I would like to touch on some of the key areas of problems and where we are and what are the concerns and why is G25 so worried when growth seems to be quite good. Anyway, let me start by saying that yes, the economy has done well. We have managed the commodity price decline, which was rather prolonged and with a lot of other global developments that happened during the same time. The measures taken were appropriate, and we have, been able to sustain what I call low to moderate growth. So why is G25 so concerned? We are concerned because we see what Malaysia needs is long-term sustainable growth. We just don't want to see quarter-to-quarter reports. We want to see a certainty that the fundamentals are in place that will guarantee long-term growth and that we will be able to continue to manage the global uncertainties quite well. Now, we also want inclusive growth. We also want high-quality growth. The World Bank and the IMF has been very upbeat about our growth rates in the recent past. Now, that is because they compare Malaysia to the region. They compare Malaysia to the developing world. To me, the analysis should be is to rate us according to our potential. Are we actually growing to realize the potential? Malaysia has put in a lot of good policies in place. We had the highest expenditure on education to GDP in the 60s, well into the 90s. We have built in a lot of human capacity. We have built in incentives for investments. We have industrialized quite early. So our potential is much, much more than the countries around us. So we should be measuring, and I think, and we have set up all these targets that increasingly we are beginning not to be able to meet. In the past, we always meet all our 5-year Malaysia plans, but more recently we are failing on the new economic model, etc. So therefore, the need is to compare us to our potential, and not just to compare to us with regional partners or countries that are still in the developing country mode. So it's to compare that we can actually arrive at the potential high income that we wanted. We can be the Taiwans and the Korea of the world, and why are we not there? That is our concern. So then this issue begets the question, is growth good? Is growth sustainable? Do we have both the speed and the quality of growth for high income status? We feel not, because of the weakening of the economic fundamentals. Now, I would just run through of the 5 basic economic fundamentals that I think is sort of putting us on a risky track of not achieving where we want to be. One is the growth is not felt by the masses. So there is a disconnect between what you see in the GDP numbers and what is felt by the people on the street. Now, this is because we have a situation of low wages. Wages are not rising. Prices are rising. Low disposable incomes. Now, these 3 issues should be looked at a package. Now, low wages is the result of long-term, it's big, I would think it's been more than 5 years, so it's long-term. You know, the poor labor policies, poor labor management, foreign labor policies that not aligned to take advantage of skills and build up capacity for longer-term growth. You can manage higher prices. Okay, let me put it this way. In a growing economy, as you develop, prices are going to rise because you are getting more goods, you are getting higher quality goods, and there is competition. Say, for example, things like a washing machine cost $800 when I got married 40 years ago. And it is still $800 today, but of better quality. So certain things, the competition has made prices sustainable. But there are other things like food items that continue to increase. But the issue is one should be able to manage the price increase as long as the price increase reflects quality, better choices. The time that you are not able to manage is because your wages are not rising faster than prices. That is because productivity is not moving. To a large extent, we have had this low wage, low productivity syndrome with the advent of foreign workers coming in. It's not, I am a very strong believer of allowing migration, allowing workers to cross border, because I think this is a way of increasing distribution of global income, that poor from other countries can become a bit more wealthy. But the policy must be right. It must be to the national advantage. So in our report, we have put forward a series of recommendations on adjustments to the foreign labor policy, and much of it has to do with governance in the admission and administration of foreign labor. There must be better balance between capital and labor. Right now, capitalists are getting a lot of high income, so the rich are getting richer, but labor is not getting fair rewards. There need to be a good incentive system to capitalists to bring in more capital, more equipment, so that they can, and also training of labor, including foreign labor, and get them to increase our productivity. That is talking about growth for the masses. Disposable income. Disposable income, we pay a lot of taxes that does not contribute directly to the welfare of the country. For example, on cars, etc. This erodes disposable income. For the bottom 40%, their disposable income is being eroded. GST is good. We think it is necessary. It is part of the what you call progressive tax structures that we need. But they are now in the tax net of, they still buy telephones, although a lot of the GST products are actually zero tariffs for the poor, but they still buy telephones, they still buy machinery and all that for which they have to pay. So they are now, the tax net coverage is now broader. So it is incumbent on the government to look at these issues, that there must be a fairer distribution so that the disposable incomes for the bottom 40% is not eroded. What is important to remember is propensity to consume by the poor is 100%. If their disposable incomes are manageable and continues to rise, they contribute to consumption and they will contribute to sustainable growth. Second is the fiscal issues. Yes, we've done very well in terms of bringing down the fiscal deficit to GDP. We had to do it because the rating agencies were threatening to downgrade the country, and that will bring us to lower than investment grade. But unfortunately, sure, the improvement was to some extent due to GST, but it was also severe cutbacks that actually could impair future growth. Serious cutbacks in education, serious cutback in health is going to affect our capacity for human development. That would mean productivity for the future. And second, the health issues. Health is a very important social safety net. We do not have a structured safety net, and health is the key social safety net for our population, and this is what going to give them the confidence that they have good health facilities that can sustain them and therefore contribute to their productivity. And there is also the issue of fiscal inefficiency and leakages. Development expenditure relative to operating expenditure is now very low, and like was said by our keynote speaker, that we are actually borrowing a lot. I agree, it is okay to borrow for infrastructure and all that, but if you are building infrastructure at several times the cost of a global cost, then something is not right. That means there are extensive leakages from fiscal expenditure. So these are something that will not augur well for the future, and you are increasing your debt much more than necessary. Increasing the debt for our next generation carries significant high risk of macroeconomic instability. External sector risk, number 3. The current account is narrowing. Exports are doing well, yet our current account is not as strong as what we used to be, and that is because we are not getting the services inflows that we should be getting in the 80s and into the 90s. You know, when we started the twinning programs and all that, we did a lot of work to develop the local services sector so that the outflows on services would be less. And that would help us to sustain any shortfall in the trade balance. But that is not happening now, and our services deficit continues to grow. Exchange rate depreciation. Now, of course, you say the exchange rate is improving now, but when the exchange rate, we look at, it is good to argue, oh, all countries depreciated against the US dollar. But we depreciated more against the regional currencies. That is the issue. That is what we need to compare. And the recent depreciation, is it going to move? Is it going to be sustainable? Then we need to analyze all the external balances. We still have very high overseas investments, etc. But my concern is mainly that the current appreciation, sure, exports is doing well, but it is on the back, it is against the backtracking of liberalization of the foreign exchange markets. That now exporters are required to retain funds at home and all that, which we had liberalized before. If it is an appreciation in a liberalized environment, then we are sure that this is real appreciation, that it is really market driven. So these are some of the concerns on the external front. Then the third part on the external front is contingent liabilities. Contingent liabilities has been rising very significantly. The IMF did a simulation, and if it were to happen, our contingent liabilities to be realized, our debt would go to 65% of GDP. This would mean that we are a highly indebted country under the World Bank definitions. The issue then is really also whether this contingent liability, the numbers that the IMF use, is it comprehensive? Does it include the 1 MDB parts? We don't know. So there's also a lack of transparency that again creates a concern. Now, the fourth one is competition and GLC. Any country wanting to move forward to become a Korea, a Taiwan, must open up its market to competition. We, on the other hand, see more and more acquisition by GLCs. We did quite a lot of work for the new economic model. We came up with strategic plans as to how GLCs should be diverse, and we agree there should be GLCs to take care of certain strategic sectors, but GLCs should not compete with the private sector. Sometimes I wonder, at one time I was analyzing a lot on the overseas investments. Malaysia, for a developing country in our level of development, we are one of the highest in having overseas investment. That's not bad as long as that overseas investment is like an external arm of your domestic economy. But I sometimes wonder whether the private sector, because they are now competing domestically on an uneven playing field with the presence of so many GLCs, that they choose to invest abroad. And this is part of the issue that also can cause depreciation of the currency. Number 5, I have a few of other very important areas where it is not direct, but it affects the economic fundamentals. I will not go into detail, but it's comprehensively addressed in the book. Education. I think maybe Tan Sri Sharif may be talking a bit more. We need governance in education, governance at the school level, governance at the ministry level, governance in good policy making on education. The tax structure is out of line. We are no longer an industrialized country for which our tax structure seems to be taken care of. We've moved beyond industrialization, and yet there has never been a public review of the tax system. We need to have a different tax system with technology, with what you call disruptive technology, etc. Then more targeted, more structured, and outcome-based support for the poor, for the bottom 40%. The World Bank and other, the World Bank in particular, has done a lot of work where people have risen out of poverty, graduated, and they continue to become wealthy. That is not the case in Malaysia. We've achieved on some ends in education and all that, but we seem to have backtracked, and the number of urban poor and rural poor seems now to be rising again. We need workplace reforms, we need worker rights to be in place, etc. Let me then just conclude by saying that we want reforms to correct these weakening fundamentals. We want it so that we can realize our economic growth potential. We want to be competitive in the region. We want to move forward. We feel that Malaysia is lagging. We were ahead of the region, but now the region is moving very fast because they are undertaking significant reforms. I did a whole year's work in Indonesia. If you see the reforms going on there, you'll be quite, you'll admire what the Indonesians are doing. They are even reforming their parliament. They have brought in Commonwealth Foundation for Democracy to help them improve their processes in parliament, and they're not even a Commonwealth country. So a lot of things are happening in Indonesia, a lot is happening in Vietnam, so we will actually be left behind if we really don't do quick, substantive, and real structural changes. For me, my friends say, why doing all this work and getting all stressed out? I think it's for my children and my grandchildren. I really do not want to see Malaysia being the backyard of Asia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dato Latifah. Very interesting talk. A lot of us have food for thought, and I don't think that I've heard any other speaker as good as she is regarding strengthening our economic sector. Thank you, Dato Latifah. Now, the next speaker needs no introduction. He has been introduced. So it just leaves me to say that he's a prolific writer, often writes to the media. You must have read it in the Sun and Star and New Straits Times. And he's perhaps the most visible and sought after G25 member, together with Dato Noor Farida. So ladies and gentlemen, my pleasure to introduce this morning Tan Sri Sharif bin Muhammad Kassim, and he's going to talk to us on reforms for stronger oversight by Parliament and the civil service. Tan Sri.
Thank you very much, Tan Sri Ismail. In view of the time, I will be as brief as possible, so that you can have time to raise questions. Now, if we want Parliament to play a role in oversight, then Parliament should not just be a body for legislation. It should also be overseeing the functions of government, the ministries, the ministers, and their civil servants. But if we discuss this, when we discuss this with members of Parliament, they say, yes, we are holding the ministers accountable. We always ask, we raise a lot of questions for them to answer. They answer the questions, we have a debate with them. And then they point out to us that they have the Parliamentary Audit Committee, which is a standing committee, which discusses the Auditor General's annual report in detail. And then they also point out to us that whenever the government tables a bill for legislation, there is debate. I think we admit all that. That is true. But what is lacking in Malaysia is that there are no standing committees and select committees like they have in Western countries, where each committee specializes on a certain subject. They are advised by professionals, and they meet regularly. In fact, members of Parliament in Britain and in the Congress, when they are appointed as representatives of the people in the legislature, that's almost a full-time job for them. And they go to their office, they go to their parliamentary office, they go to their congressional office daily, like other civil servants, because they have a staff. So that is what we would like to see also in our parliament. For example, we would like to see standing committees on finance, on budget, on education, on health, social security, defense, foreign policy. And then we should also have select committees on subjects which have become matters of national concern. For example, 1MDB or the ECRL. ECRL, there's a lot of discussion in the media. Nobody knows really what is the actual cost of the project. So a subject like this, I think in a mature democracy, they would have a hearing, they would have a public hearing to discuss the project, because it's going to be huge. It's going to affect everybody in the country. All taxpayers, will be involved if they cannot meet the debt repayment. But this, I think you all know, so I don't need to elaborate how it works, because those who see CNN, BBC will know how the congressional committees and the parliamentary committees work. But when we discuss with the members of parliament, they give various excuses. They say, no, our members of parliament, they prefer to talk about women's skirts rather than complicated financial matters. Then one minister told me, no, our members of parliament are not equipped for this kind of discussion. They can raise general questions, but they won't know how to ask the questions, let's say, regarding the transactions, 1MDB transactions. How do you expect our members of parliament? Yes, we agree. That is why we recommend that parliament should have its own professional staff. Consisting of lawyers, accountants, economists, analysts, They professionally, their job is to be in parliament. Their job is, they will have office in parliament, and their job is to advise the committee, let's say the committee on finance, Their job is to advise the committee on finance. When they have a hearing, their job is to advise the committee on finance what are the questions to raise. Some say no, even if you have that, our members of parliament, they wouldn't like to raise all these questions. They don't want to embarrass the minister. The minister could be their friend, and they will. You give them all the support, also they won't raise. I doubt it, because as our colleague Dato Latifah was saying, in Indonesia they are reforming their parliament, and they do have all these committees which really goes into detail. When each legislation is presented to parliament, there will be a standing committee which will examine the bill in detail, or if there is a national issue, the select committee will meet and summon ministers, civil servants. They will also have experts from outside to come in and testify before the committee. Now, it's very interesting. I watched a BBC program where the select committee was asked Tony Blair to give evidence. Tony Blair, the previous Prime Minister of Britain, why he brought the country into war with Iraq. What struck me was that none of the members of Parliament in the Select Committee raised any question. But the questioning was done by a Queen's Counsel. That means the Select Committee appointed a Queen's Counsel to be their to do the questioning. I think we can do the same here. If members of Parliament say that they are not well equipped to call Minister of Finance officials and so on to grill them on one MDB, that's fine. What they can do is they can have expert accountants or professionals, to do to raise the questions, asking the CEO of one MDB, the Minister of Finance officials, what happened, why, and to explain all the transactions. So I think there are no excuses. It can be done. I think it's a matter of political will. The civil service, now this is a very broad term. Of course, it comprises the managerial, administrative, professional and technical services that staff the ministries and departments, and also under them there's a huge number of specialized institutions and regulatory bodies. All ministries and departments, they are responsible for spending the billions of ringgit under the budget, both operating expenditure and development expenditure. Now, Cynthia, I think she's here. I think C4 is doing a very detailed study on how procurement is done in the government sector. As she has said in their report, and based on my own experience in the Ministry of Finance, the expenditures, government expenditures, are governed by a large number of, by the Financial Procedures Act, and a large number of Treasury regulations and Treasury instructions. It's a very elaborate system of checks and balance to avoid fraud and corruption. And there are detailed instructions regarding the tender procedures and issue of contracts. However, as you all know, what we see is that the number of cases of poor financial management keeps on rising, as reported in the Auditor General's annual report. Of course, we must give credit to the government, which has done a lot to simplify procedures and remove bottlenecks, because these bottlenecks can create the incentive for corruption. The quality of counter services has improved a lot in recent years, and the government is trying to do more. I think recently we heard about the government trying to establish integrity units in ministries and departments to do regular surveillance against bad practices. That's important because it's better to do preventive. It's good to have preventive measures on corruption before corruption actually happens. But Malaysian society, we are getting more and more sophisticated, and we are demanding more in terms of performance and results. One problem facing the civil service today is the credibility gap. In other words, despite all that, what the government is doing, I think people doubt whether there is a real professionalism in the civil service. Rightly or wrongly, people believe that the top civil servants Although they are supposed to advise political masters on policy and implementation, they have no or little influence in the decision-making process, and that every ministerial decision is politically motivated. So I think it's very important to find some way of convincing the public and also the ranks and file of the civil service that the top civil servants can control the excesses of their political masters and that they can be trusted to be independent and professional. So one idea that we have promoted, and sometimes we get scolded for it, is that maybe it's time to break away from the traditional practice of appointing civil servants to top positions and introduce a competitive process to select the most qualified who are trustworthy and who can restore public confidence on the professional credibility of the civil service. Now, this is not a theoretical suggestion. Well, in fact, we did it in PLUS. I am chairman of PLUS. When the previous CEO decided to retire, we appointed a select committee, we conducted a search for the best candidates. It could be internal, it could be external, and we chose somebody from outside, a Shell executive, to become the new CEO of PLUS. So it is done. I think all companies do that. They appoint a select committee, a search committee they call it, a search committee. The search committee will go out and look out for the best candidate and recommend to the human resource committee. The human resource committee brings it to the board for the decision. So it's all very, very professional, very open, and this can be done in the civil service too. Maybe not for all appointments, but I would say for the top 4 or 5 posts in the civil service, open it to all the departments, to see who are interested to become, let's say, the Secretary General, Ministry of Finance, or the Director General of the EPU, and also maybe open it up to the private sector too. Why not? If there's somebody who is really highly respected as an economist, maybe he is the right, as an economist, let's say in a bank, maybe he is the right person to become the Director General of the EPU. So this, of course, will be a very controversial point in the civil service, but I think it's something for us to think about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tan Sri Sharif. I think those are very interesting viewpoints that merit a lot of discussion from the floor. I have my own questions as well, but let me give a chance for those in the audience to raise questions. Just a few ground rules. Those of you asking questions, please identify yourself and keep your questions short so that we have as many questions as possible from the floor. Thank you very much. Who's going to be the first person to ask questions? Oh yes, please, Tan Sri Raymond. Can you give a mic to Tan Sri Raymond, please? Is there a mic?
Or shall I try my voice?
Ooh boy, woohoo!
Being the health DG, I don't think you should, torture your voice so much.
Train my vocal cords. Tan Sri Ismail Merican and this wonderful panel. I wish I was a member of Group of 25. They're all my colleagues actually. Now, first of all, allow me to congratulate G25. I say to myself often, thank God for Group 25. Let's give them a big clap. I hope my colleague Tan Sri Sharif and Tan Sri Alwi and others, Dr. Farida, Dr. Merican, they all grow from strength to strength. Now my question. I admire the comprehensive way you have considered the subject of good governance, and I cannot, even if I want to be critical, find fault with your recommendations. My concern is that all your proposals go against the interest of the ruling class. Why would they want to adopt your principles? I call this, as the World Bank has called it earlier, state capture. They want to capture all these institutions so that they can continue their power in perpetuity. That being the case, how do you think these proposals of yours can be put to government so that they will accept it and we can move on? I have grave doubts that they will adopt it. What do you think can be done? Thank you.
Yes, I think we'll get to a few questions, then we will answer. That's one. Thank you. Please. Thank you, Tan Sri Raymond.
Good morning. I'm Chin Huat from Penang Institute. My question is to Dato Farida. Dato Farida, the question is for you. I support completely the separations of AG from public prosecution. My question is that must AG necessarily be a non-partisan and apolitical post as government advisor? What about the other options of it being a parliamentarian as a cabinet minister and therefore accountable to the parliament? In that context, because what is useful related to AG Chamber is that at the moment, state governments often cannot have legal advice from their legal advisor who takes orders from Putrajaya. So if we're going to turn that into a political position where you can actually appoint your own AG or state legal advisor, then there's greater possibilities for different opinions. So I'd like to have your view on this. Thank you.
One more question before we ask the panelists to respond. Yes, please.
Thank you, Tan Sri. I am P.S. Ranjan. I'm a lawyer. I have a question for Dr. Noor Farida. You had given your ideas regarding reform of the judiciary. In my opinion, after 4 decades as a lawyer, I say that reform of the judiciary will not work unless there is reform of the legal profession. It is my thesis that the legal profession is behind much of the injustice that we see in this country. Injustice in the courts, injustice in business, in politics, in public administration. Once at a forum a few years ago, I asked a senior lawyer who was once secretary to the Bar Council whether he agreed with me that lawyers were behind much of the injustice that we see in this country. He agreed with me and went on to say the black sheep are in the majority. Much of what goes on, I say, is the product of lawyers who have caused a lot of trouble. We just have too many lawyers, but we don't have enough good lawyers. There will always be a shortage of good, honorable, ethical lawyers. That is a serious problem, and I ask that you address that point too when you come up with your proposals regarding reform of the judiciary. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Tan Sri Sharif, to respond to the first question.
Tan Sri Raymond asks, why would the government want to listen to or accept the recommendations such as those made by G25. I think, as I mentioned in my opening statement, reforms do not come from the government. Reforms come from the people. So I think civil society organizations, if we can convince the people that these changes are necessary, eventually at some point in time, the government will listen. And I think even in the area of economics, you will notice that the government was very reluctant to introduce the fiscal measures, GST and removal of the subsidies. But what happened was that there was pressure from the market that if no action is seen to be taken, the rating agencies would downgrade the sovereign rating. And I think that pushed the minister, who was also the Prime Minister, to make the unpopular decision. I think there will be instances like this. So I think if we can make the public realize the importance of these reforms, I think one day it will happen. Now, of course, if the government is too powerful in Parliament also, it may delay the reform. So I think there should be more balanced representation in Parliament. Nobody can decide that except the voters. But if there is a more balanced representation in Parliament, that can also help to expedite the reforms. That's all I can say. Thank you.
Thank you, Tan Sri. In other words, you're very optimistic, which is good, and a lot depends on the public and the voters. That's the message. Dato Latifah, please.
A lot of people do ask me this question. Okay, you put in all these reforms, you think hard, you consult, you have focus groups, you come up with, what you think are good solutions. So who is going to take it up? I think as NGO group, it is just incumbent on us to put out these ideas. And reforms is very difficult. Reforms in good times have been difficult, some more reforms in bad times. I always use the twinning, universities as an example. When we were having serious deficits in our services account, one of the main expenditure was education abroad. So Bank Negara took it under its wing because it's part of the balance of payments issues. Under that guise, Tun Ismail actually set up a special committee of private and public sector, SecGens and corporate heads. And there was a secretariat. I was part of that secretariat. And that is way back, I recall starting the work around 1985, 86. It was not until 1992 that we were able to go to Cabinet, put up the comprehensive proposals, and Cabinet decided to form a Cabinet committee to look to its implementation. So sometimes it takes a lot of time. There are also a lot of legal framework. We had to amend the Colleges Act so that you can do the 3 plus 0, 2 plus 1 and all those type of things. A lot of work needs to be done for implementation. So it is quite onerous. So today we feel that, okay, we put out all these ideas on the table. Of course, elections are coming. There are so many political parties. It is up to these political parties, if they feel that these are reforms worth, it will be great if they can put it in their manifesto. And we can see some way forward. For the public, we would like the public to be more and more aware that these are issues that needs to be addressed. The more people who are aware, the more people who talk about it, then the momentum gets going and the demand from the public for change will come. I mean, it's optimistic, but if you want the country to move forward, you must have some idealism. Otherwise, if you sit back, oh, I do this, nothing will happen, then nothing will happen, and we continue to backtrack. So we'll try to do what we can, and we hope somebody, somewhere, at some point in time, is going to pick up these issues and do good for the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Dato. Farida. In other words, you're also optimistic. It can happen. Just now, I was asked by one of my ex-pengarah of HKL, what can we do? You talk and talk, but can this happen? We've been talking and talking, but nothing is happening. So she's not very optimistic. But I hope by the time she leaves this hall and this forum, she will be as optimistic as the panelists and all of you in the audience. Dato' Farida, sorry.
Just a real life example during the Asian crisis. The changes, the reforms that happened in Indonesia, a lot of it came from NGOs. It was NGOs that pushed a lot of these reforms. So there is hope. But they had the advantage because the government at that time allowed freedom of the press. So that was the advantage they had. But still all is not lost. So NGOs can actually, play an important role.
I'll take the last two questions. Yeah. In answer to Chin Huat's question about turning the AG's office into a cabinet post, it has happened before, because in the 70s we had Tan Sri Kade Yusof, who was a member of cabinet, who was then AG, and he was a cabinet member. But that doesn't solve the problem of independence. Well, of course, but now, the government does not enjoy 2/3 majority. So if AG were to be a cabinet member, he would be answerable to Parliament. And MPs can ask him, very awkward questions with regard to his decisions, to his policies, and so on. But with regard to the appointment of state legal advisors, anything to do with law in this country comes under the umbrella of the AG's chambers, or the Judicial and Legal Service. And in the States, is the AG who appoints the state legal advisors, who's also an EXCO member of the states, and he is a representative of the AG. I don't think at the moment the states are free to appoint their own legal advisors, like for example the Menteri Besars or the chief ministers and so on are free to appoint their own legal advisors, unless of course it's just an informal, they can have sort of informal consultants, informal advisors, but they cannot formally appoint a legal advisor to advise the state government. So currently it's still, all the state legal advisors comes from AG's chambers. Will it solve the problem? Will it solve the problem of the independence of AG to turn the office into a political office? I'm not so sure about that. Of course, it's accountable to Parliament, but it again depends on whether Parliament is active enough, or whether they can have select committees and so on to question decisions of AG and so on. So to us, it is still desirable to divide, the current dual roles of AG, from AG as a state legal, as an advisor to the government, and also to have a separate office of Director of Public Prosecutions. And what is important is that the selection, the appointment must not be made by the Prime Minister. Currently, the Prime Minister appoints most of the heads of our very important public institutions. He has the power to hire and fire. And so long as this power remains in the hands of one person, then it is liable to be abused. And we have seen it being abused. So what is important is that there must be an independent commission, transparent process to appoint the AG and to dismiss the AG. Likewise, if a separate Department of Director of Public Prosecutions is established. Similarly, he must be appointed and he must by an independent commission, but through a very transparent process, and it must be on merit, and likewise his dismissal must also be through the same commission. And similarly also, as I've said before, with the judiciary and so on, only then will you have institutions which are independent and which is not beholden to the executive. With regard to the last question by Mr. Rajan, let's face it, every profession will have their black sheep, but I think it's a rather sweeping statement to say that the majority of lawyers are all are suspect in their conduct. Well, they have the Legal Profession Act to govern their conduct, and of course we have the Bar Council, and the Bar Council has a disciplinary committee to discipline lawyers for misconduct, but the public, aggrieved members of the public who have suffered at the hands of unscrupulous lawyers, they are at liberty to raise, these kind of issues with the Bar Council, which I am sure will not hesitate to take action. So I'm not sure what was the proposal to address this problem.
Let me clarify. I say that the bar's disciplinary procedure is weak and ineffective. In fact, I think the medical council's disciplinary procedure is better.
Well, the bar has their annual AGM, and I think that should be the proper forum to raise this. If you feel that the procedure is weak, that the disciplinary committee is weak, then there must, lawyers should come up with proposals to strengthen the disciplinary committee. Yeah, again, this is part of governance. But talking about governance, I sit on a board of directors of a public listed company. And what is amazing is that the standard of corporate governance in this country is second to none. Securities Commission, and also the Bursa Malaysia, and so on. And they've recently, of course, amended the Companies Act 2016, and we've got the Code of Corporate Governance. The corporate governance is second to none. All we're hoping for, why can't the government governance also follow suit to have, the standard of governance which would be the envy of other democratic countries. That is our hope.
Very good, Dato' Farida. Questions? Yes, please. Gentlemen. Okay.
Thank you, Honorable Moderator. Stephen Leong from University Tunku Abdul Rahman. On political reform, administrative reform, Dato' Noor Farida, I'm sure all of us agree with you on the salient points that you have given us. Perhaps too, in terms of limiting the power of the Prime Minister, would you agree that the tenure of the Prime Minister should be limited? Thank you.
More questions? No, this is very unusual. Where? Oh, yes. Please, Latifah.
Good morning. I'm enjoying the talk. I think we are the minority here from Sabah. And I'd like to ask you, you mentioned about reforms and all that, and us being in Sabah, we make up about a quarter of the population of Malaysia. But somehow or other, when you talk about all the development that's going on, I cannot help but feel excluded coming from Sabah. again, like I said, there's only each time, and I used to be involved in the NGOs and manufacturing sector. We were invited by the government to give a talk and to listen up. And at the time when Dato was still the minister, and I was the only representative from Sabah. Now, how do you expect for a country to move forward when a quarter of the population in Malaysia, I can tell you that a lot of us are feeling that we are being left behind. Anyway, when you talk about, we were already advanced, compared to the other countries around the region before, but we've always been behind in Sabah in terms of infrastructure, in terms of education, a lot of things. Never mind about those who are with the government now and all those people, the ministers that you hear, they are actually not part of the general public in Sabah. But how do we move forward as a country when we are feeling that as Sabahans and even Sarawakians, we are very much left behind. And when there are talks like this, and they talk about even the election the last time, there was no Sabahan speaking from, giving our point of view. Whereas but then when they talk about how we lost the election, actually it was Sabah and Sarawak who actually played a very significant factor in the last election, because people in the rural areas are not getting the messages because we are so far behind. In fact, even like with all this, we feel honored to be amongst really, all of you here, but there are very, very few of us in Sabah who's got kind of positions and the kind of exposure that you all are having. So I would like maybe Latifah to talk something about that. When you talk about development, how do you actually reach out to Sabahans? Are you doing enough? Are you doing enough? Because like I said, when you talk about Malaysia, I said, are you talking about Sabah Sarawak, your culture in Malaysia? Are you talking just about the Malay culture? Because Kadazan Dusun, our culture is completely different. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Datin. I'm also glad to note that Dato Johan will be speaking at the forum as well. He's from Sabah. Ladies and gentlemen, in the interest of time, I have to stop now. So we will allow the panelists to answer those two questions that have been asked, and then I'll do a quick summary, and then we'll finish the early morning forum. Tan Sri Sharif, you want to say something about the two questions?
I think Stephen Leong asked the question about whether we agree that the Prime Minister's tenure should be limited to 2 terms. I noticed that the Pakatan Harapan has that in their manifesto. I personally would think that is a good idea, and I hope you all agree too. On the second question from Datin, I wouldn't want to speak specifically on Sabah, but I think generally it is an issue about autonomy. Personally, and I think also our G25 colleagues, I think we agree on the principle of decentralization. The problem in Malaysia is that there is too much power controlled at the center. This can affect the fair distribution of resources in the country, and also it can lead to nepotism and cronyism. So Malaysia is a federation, so I think as a federation, I think states should have more power, financial powers, and also administrative powers. And of course, in the case of Sabah, because of the special agreement, I would personally think that both Sabah and Sarawak should be given autonomy to manage their own affairs. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tan Sri.
Okay, when I talk about economic reforms, it's applicable nationwide. If these reforms, of course, a lot of it are at the federal level, but it's going to affect all states. And normally when you do changes, you would pay particular attention at the implementation stage. You would pay particular, say we talk about the foreign labor policy. It's very pertinent to Sabah. You know, a lot needs to be done on the foreign labor policy in Sabah, you know, to better manage the labor market. So it is more federal level measures that has implications on all the states, and adjustments for locational issues would need to be undertaken when you want to adopt the measures. On decentralization, yes, we've been talking a lot on decentralization. Say, for example, I believe Sarawak has achieved certain independence on its education policies. We believe that we need to move forward. I use Indonesia a lot because I'm familiar. They have implemented quite with mixed results on decentralization, even where decisions on community development, which is quite relevant for areas like Sabah, Sarawak, where communities take charge of developments, infrastructure, building bridges, building schools, and it's proven to be quite successful in the outer areas of Indonesia. In fact, some of the work that we do in G25, where it has a really direct economic implication, we also work with the Malaysian Economic Association. In fact, we are planning to do a forum on decentralization, and we are hoping to work with other organizations on the potential of decentralization, and it could actually lead to greater competitive policies amongst the states, and states can actually compete. Just like in the United States, you have a lot of areas where states have primary decisions, and and they compete for investment and all that. Thank you.
I'll just take the question by Datin. Well, we really sympathize with the people of Sabah and Sarawak. You have been betrayed by the central government with regard to the implementation of the Malaysia Act. Because under the 1963 agreement, you're supposed to be one of 3 states. Now you're just one of 14. And you have been marginalized. So, well, the thing is, if you want to make changes, I think, you will have to do it at the ballot box. and reclaim your rights under the 1963 agreement. Even the 20-point agreement, 18-point agreement for Sabah, for Sarawak, and 20-point agreement for Sabah, is not even being implemented. Because if you remember the RUU 355, they were going to, if it were to be pushed through, it's going to affect Sabah and Sarawak as well. Even though the 18-point agreement, the first point said, and the 20-point agreement, the first point said there shall be no state religion for the people of Sabah, for the state of Sabah, and for the state of Sarawak. And yet, if a federal law were to be passed, it's going to affect both Sabah and Sarawak. So this is something that needs to be rectified, and I think the people of Sabah and Sarawak will have to, in a way, renegotiate and make sure that the central government implements fully, Malaysia Agreement 1963, because it's your right. And it's up to the people of Sabah Sarawak to make sure that you push for it. Right now, you're allowing yourself to be ridden over roughshod by the central government. And I fully agree with what Tan Sri Sharif has said. There should be devolution. There should be, more autonomy, and also autonomy over resources for both Sabah and Sarawak. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you agree with me that we had a very interesting first session this morning. there's a lot of talk of reforms, and we talk about the appointment of people in key positions so that we can get good governance. And those people in power, they can act independently without fear or favor, so that they can perform their duties to the best of their ability in the interest of the rakyat. It has to be selfless in all, that they do. So ladies and gentlemen, I don't want to summarize too much because I think you have heard the reform, you heard the messages. I would just like you to join me in thanking the three speakers, Dato Farida, Dato Latifah, and Tan Sri Sharif Muhammad Kassim. And I would also like to thank members of the audience who have participated in a big way to make this forum a huge success. So don't forget, ladies and gentlemen, the responsibility is yours. Don't just blame the government. You got to make sure that when you exercise your right to vote, you must vote. Send the message across. Vote wisely and make sure you get whatever it is that you're asking for. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much. A large round of applause for everyone, please.